Does Russia want to see Ukraine cut down to a stump of its former self? I'm Paul, U.S. Army combat veteran. It's December 14th, 2023. This is your daily Ukraine update. Let's get into it. Okay, first we're taking a look at the control map, and as you can see, Russian forces making a number of advances across the front lines. First, outside Stepova, you can see Russian forces entering the town itself, crossing from this sort of road leading into Stepova proper. Looks like basically the first, calling this city block is generous. The first couple houses along this initial street. And while, again, the fall of Stepova would not necessarily portend any grand, devastating effect, it would be a stepping stone for Russia on the way to cutting off the remainder of Avdiivka. They'd probably have a hard time. Their likely next objective would be something like Berdichi, and they'd probably try to just follow this sort of river here in order to apply lots and lots of pressure onto Ukrainian forces who might be trying to resupply and keep the fight happening in Avdiivka. But you can see that even taking Stepova and Berdichi won't really serve to cut off routes into Avdiivka proper. There's still going to be this large corridor controlled by Ukraine. So I maintain the theory that Ukraine is primarily focused right now on using its troops to keep these corridors open, and they're successful in that. Are largely successful in that. But it remains to be seen over the next couple of days of what it's going to mean to take Stepova. Okay, so the other areas where we've seen some progress, one is in the north near Lyman Pershi. Again, these advances in the north, while they're indicative of Russian action, certainly, you can see that this is just flipping some territory, some forested areas here, and aren't really indicative of any kind of larger system or larger offensive action that's going to result in any major territorial changes. Even if they could take this no-name town of Sinkivka, it won't necessarily be the road to any other major sort of breakthrough or subsequent towns that Russia could take. This is rough, hilly, forested terrain. It's going to be unforgiving for Russian forces. And I think this is more about Russia just seizing an opportunity where they sensed some softening of Ukrainian lines. And of course, in Marinka, exactly what we talked about yesterday. Having taken the last of the town itself, Russia's probably going to relocate its troops right to this region here in the northern half of the town and advance into the town. So they're probably 2 or 3 days away from taking the entirety of Marinka, which, again, will it prove a stepping stone elsewhere? I'm not sure. But again, this is part of Ukraine's strategy in this phase of the conflict, right? You can see Russia escalating its offensive actions, 89 combat engagements, so more than double the average number we saw a month ago. But the distribution looks a bit lighter than usual, right? You see a bit more action in the Verbova-Rubtina region. You also see more along Lyman-Pershi and here in the north, Kremina-Lyman and Lyman-Pershi, somewhat less in and around Bakhmut and much less in Avdiivka. So possibly a sign that either Russia's concentrating its attacks in smaller geographic locations, or more likely, we're seeing Russia disperse its attacks a bit more, probably to try to fix Ukrainian forces across the front lines. Now, Ukraine has an answer to this. The answer is, of course, their use of combat drones. And if you want to see some of their tactics in action, today's video on Combat Vet News takes a deep dive into that. We look at 2 Russian drone videos that really capture how Russia is using these drones, how Ukraine is using these drones to punish Russia every time they move their troops onto an offensive. These drones are brutal and vicious in terms of their ability to identify attack formations, direct artillery onto them, and then clean up the battlefield. It's really pretty scary how much of the roles that would have been done by light infantry can now be done by these observation drones, even though the technology is not that mature right now. If you're interested in seeing that, I can't show it here. It's on combatvetnews.com. Link is in the description. You can get any one of these tiers to become a premium member and get access to the uncensored combat footage that drops twice a week. It's the deep dive analysis you can't get anywhere else and the best way to support the channel. You guys know sponsors really aren't interested in sponsoring many videos because of the type of content I cover. So I depend on you guys. So thanks to all the members of combatvetnews.com for making sure that me and the team can continue to do this. Anyway, let's take a look at some of the uncomfortable rhetoric coming out of Dmitry Medvedev. So here's what was sort of weird. The Kremlin, now having blunted Ukraine's counteroffensive, is now returning to its rhetoric about being extremely hyper-expansionist, which is worrying because, again, the idea was that the Russian military, right, would be ground to nothing in Ukraine and would limit Russian territorial ambitions throughout Europe. But that's not how things have come to pass. Instead, you're hearing the chairman of the Russian Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, deliberately misinterpret President Biden's response to a media question. A reporter asked Biden if the United States policy is to win the war or help Ukraine defend itself, right? Which is two different things. During a joint press conference with Zelensky, Biden said the United States wants to see Ukraine win, and that winning means Ukraine is a sovereign, independent nation that can afford to defend itself today and deter future aggression. Now, a sovereign nation is key here, right? That it's not dominated by a foreign power, that's independent, which is sort of redundant. And if someone else controls large portions of your territory, then you're not a sovereign nation and you're not independent. You're partially occupied, right? It's like saying, is Gaza independent? No, it's partially occupied and controlled and not fully in control of its own destiny as a nation. So that is how that is interpreted in English. But Medvedev misrepresented the statements, saying that he interpreted it to say, oh, look, the United States would be fine as long as Ukraine has sovereignty over some portion of its territory. As long as Ukraine is sovereign somewhere and independent of, and some portion of Ukraine is not occupied, that is the conditions the United States wants to see. They're pretending like Biden has offered Russia a dramatic change to their desired outcomes when it's pretty clear that's not the case. Medvedev claimed this is hyperbolic. Ukraine could technically meet those conditions if the entire country was simply reduced to just Lviv Oblast, for example. He falsely claims that the United States only supports Ukraine in defending itself, but therefore, by using the phrase, Ukraine defending itself, something we've been using for 2 years in this country, that actually means that the U.S. won't help Kiev launch any kind of offensive action to liberate any more of its territory, which is also just absolutely brain dead level take. And Medvedev is not an idiot. He knows what the United States really means, but what he needs to do is create this perception among the Russian public that they're somewhat close to a peace deal, that there's been real progress made, that the 300,000 Russians who've been killed in this conflict haven't had their lives completely wasted by a corrupt government, which is, of course, exactly what has actually happened. This idea, as ISW points out, this is a return to form for Russia, who believes it has the historic claim on huge portions of Europe based on some pretty spurious history. So they think that this is the U.S.'s way of saying, oh, you can have part of Ukraine. It's just absolutely stupid. And again, in 1991, remember, Ukraine gave up its nuclear weapons in exchange for an international guarantee for its territorial integrity. And so, obviously, a deal with Russia is worth literally nothing. Nothing at all. No, Russia will back out of any deal at any time as soon as it's even minorly inconvenienced. But the other countries that were signatories to this deal still have an obligation to Ukraine, because when we say this treaty guarantees your sovereignty in perpetuity, then it has to mean that. And the fact that it doesn't is itself, it makes a deal with the West also appear to be kind of worthless. So, in other news, the Senate, at least, has passed the National Defense Authorization Act. And reporting loves the fact that people love to report like it's a record-breaking deal. Listen, guys, every time there is inflation, there is it is an all-time high, right? Like the price of a Pepsi is at an all-time high. The price of chocolate is at an all-time high. So I say this because this is how inflation works. So don't be like, oh, it's an all-time high, we're spending like crazy. I think as a country, we do spend like crazy, but please bear in mind also the scale of this defense, the NDA, the National Defense Authorization Act, right? Nearly $1 trillion, 886. And that doesn't include the Department of Energy, who manages the country's nuclear arsenal and some other ancillary stuff like the intelligence apparatus, or parts of the intelligence apparatus like the CIA. So 886 billion, well, around $1 trillion. So when Biden says, so when you see 800 million, 200 million, understand how small that is compared to this. You could give him $8 billion and it would be 1%. $8 billion is 1% of 1 year of NDAA spending. Okay. Now, obviously, it's loaded with a bunch of controversial stuff, and there's always something for the politicians to fight about and pretend to be outraged by. But what I thought was interesting to get a sense of the Pentagon's spending priorities, there is $11 billion. So again, 1%. No, sorry, like 1.5% to push back against China in the Indo-Pacific, and $800 million. So that's 1/10 of 1% in military aid for Ukraine. So this is just absolutely, you have to scale. It's hard to remember the scale of these things, but remember, 800 million, 1/10 of 1%. It's your tax dollars hard at work, guys. So understand, right? Biden, of course, asking for $61 billion, which represents an eye-popping, let's see, 61 billion is going to be, what's that? 10% of the National Defense Authorization Act, going, 10% of the military budget in a year going to help Ukraine to take on a major geopolitical rival. Yeah, I'd say those are dollars well spent. But of course, the Democrats have decided, for reasons that don't make any sense, that the Ukraine war and U.S. immigration law need to be linked together, and we're never going to see a bill for immigration pass, and therefore the Republicans will have effectively killed any hope of getting major Ukrainian aid, hence the switch of Ukrainian tactics. Anyway, that's all I had, guys. Be sure to join us on Combat Vet News. Thank you to all of our members of Combat Vet News. I could not do this without you guys. Thank you so much, and I'm going to see all you guys over on the site here in a minute. Cheers.